On the 20th of March, 1974, a man stepped out in front of a car on the Mall in central London, pointed a revolver through the window at a 23-year-old woman, and told her to get out. He had already shot 4 people that evening. He wanted a ransom, he wanted a helicopter, and he wanted the daughter of the Queen of England. She looked at the gun and she gave him 4 words, "Not bloody likely." And then she talked to him, and kept him talking, until the moment came to get away. That woman had grown up watching somebody else absorb punishment without flinching. She had spent her whole childhood in a house where the most disciplined person in the building was not the sovereign. It was the man who had married the sovereign, and who had spent 20 years being told what he was allowed to be. On the 9th of April, 2021, that man died, and within days, that same daughter, the one who had spent 50 years declining to answer questions, sat down in front of a camera and started answering them. And the things she said, quietly, in that flat voice she uses to end conversations, reorganized the entire story of her parents' marriage. Because the version of that marriage you have been sold is a fairy tale with one sad chapter at the end, and Princess Anne, of all people, does not deal in fairy tales. Quick word before we go any further. I spend my time going through everything that moves around this family. The declarations, the registers, the orders in council, the small entries that nobody reads twice, and what you are about to hear is me laying the pieces out in the order I found them. Stay with this one to the end, because the last thing Anne said out loud about her father is the piece that makes the rest of it stop looking like a love story. And it is not the sentence the newspapers chose for the headline. Let me tell you what you are getting today. The story that goes around online goes like this. A boy and a girl at a naval college in 1939. A wedding in an abbey. 73 years. An old man who wanted a quiet farm at the end. That version has been sanded down until there is nothing left on it to catch your hand. The real one has a document in it, signed 8 weeks into a reign, that took a man's name off his own children. It has a household that never accepted him. It has a career that was closed like a door on a single morning in Kenya. And it has one child who watched all of it, from the age of 18 months onwards, and who turned out to be the only person in that family built like him. The marriage was not ugly the way the tabloids mean ugly. There is no screaming row that got out, no separation, no lawyer, no letter from a mistress on the record. The ugliness in it is structural. It is paperwork. It is a room full of polite people deciding what a man counts for, and Anne is the witness. She is the only one of the 4 children who saw it from his side of the table. Let me clear up the thing everybody gets wrong first, because the rest of it depends on getting this right. You will have heard it said that Philip and Elizabeth had a cold marriage, that they lived separate lives, that he spent 70 years in clubs and she spent 70 years with the corgis. That is not what the record shows. They shared a bed at Buckingham Palace for decades. He had an office a corridor away from hers. He was the first person she saw in the morning and the last at night through most of the 50s and 60s. People who worked in that building describe a marriage that ran on jokes, on shorthand, on 2 people who had been in it together since she was 13. The cold version is comforting because it is simple. The true version is worse, and it is worse in a way that took me a while to get my head around. The marriage was warm, the marriage worked, and the institution wrapped around it spent 50 years grinding the husband down anyway. Those 2 things are both true at once. Anne grew up inside that contradiction, and I think it is the reason she is the way she is. Now the object, because there is always an object. In this story it is a stack of letters. Anne kept her father's letters. She has said so herself more than once, in that dismissive way she has of mentioning something enormous, as though it were a shopping list. He wrote to her the way he wrote to everybody he took seriously. Long, careful, argumentative letters, full of questions and books and opinions, and he signed them one word, Pa. That is what she called him. Not Papa, not Father, not Sir, Pa. He was the Duke of Edinburgh to 20 million people, the master of the household to a staff of hundreds, a bloody amoeba, his own phrase, to the men who ran the palace, and to one girl at Gatcombe Park he was Pa, on paper, in ink, for over 60 years. Hold that thought. Because by the time we get to a chapel in Windsor in April 2021, and a woman reading out words about her father in front of the entire country, you are going to understand why the only title that ever mattered to him was one the crown never had the power to take away, and why his daughter was the one who gave it back to him in public. Let me go back to the beginning of Anne, because her beginning lands in the exact middle of the catastrophe. She was born on the 15th of August, 1950, at Clarence House, second child, only daughter. Which means she was 18 months old in February 1952, when her grandfather died in his sleep at Sandringham, and her mother became queen on a ladder platform in a fig tree in Kenya. She has no memory of the before. Charles does, barely. He was 3. Anne is the child who only ever knew the after. She never saw the Malta years, and they matter, so I owe you the 2 minutes. From 1949 to 1951, Philip was stationed in Malta with the Mediterranean fleet, and Elizabeth went out to join him. They rented a villa above Valletta. She had no red boxes, no household, no engagements to speak of. She drove herself. She went to the hairdresser in town. She sat in the stands and watched her husband play polo. He had his own command, a frigate, And by every account those were the happiest months either of them ever had. Anne is the child of the people those two used to be, and she was born too late to ever meet them. That is the first ugliness, and it is a quiet one. Her parents' real marriage, the version where he was a working officer and she was a young naval wife, was already buried before their daughter could walk. So the mother Anne got was the queen. And the father she got was the man the machine was already working on. And I want you to understand what the machine did, in detail, because Anne watched every stage of it and then spent her adult life quietly building the opposite of it. In April 1952, 8 weeks into the reign, Elizabeth made a declaration in council. Let me explain what that is in 10 seconds because it decides everything after it. A declaration in council is the sovereign making a formal statement in front of the Privy Council, the body of senior advisers that has existed since the medieval period, and once it is made and minuted it is not an opinion. It is the settled position of the crown. This one said that she and her children would be known as the House and Family of Windsor, and that her descendants would carry the name Windsor. His children were not going to have his name. And Anne, 18 months old, asleep in a nursery at Clarence House, was one of the two human beings on earth that page was about. Charles was the other. The surname fight that consumed her father was a fight over the name she was going to write on forms for the rest of her life, and she was a toddler, and nobody ever asked her. And she grew up and found out what had been done about her name the way everybody in that family finds out everything, slowly, sideways, from documents. The line Philip said about it afterwards is the only time in 73 years he let the public see the size of the wound. He said it in private, and it got out anyway. I am nothing but a bloody amoeba. I am the only man in the country not allowed to give his name to his own children. Read that second sentence slowly, because it is not a tantrum. It is a statement of fact. Every man in Britain in 1952, in every terraced house and pit village in the country, had the automatic right he did not have. The dock worker had it. The prisoner in his cell had it. He was the single exception on the entire island, and the exception had been made specifically about him, in writing, by the state, after his wife's grandmother and the Prime Minister decided the matter between themselves without him in the room. Now picture the childhood that produced for his daughter. Anne grew up a Windsor in a house where her father had been told his name was not good enough for her. Children notice everything. They notice who defers to whom at breakfast. They notice which parent the staff go to first. They notice when a man's own children carry a name that was imposed on him. By the time Anne was 10, she had absorbed the entire geometry of it, and everybody who knew that family says the same thing about her. Of the 4 children, she was the one like him. Same face, same walk, same temper, same total inability to pretend an interest she did not feel. Charles was his mother's son, sensitive, dutiful, readable. Anne was Paz, and that brought her a childhood nobody talks about properly. Watch the small stuff, because the small stuff is the whole of it. When the courtiers looked at Charles, they saw the heir, the investment, the future of the firm, and they handled him accordingly. When they looked at Anne, they saw the spare's little sister, a girl in a man's succession order, destined to be overtaken by any brothers who came along, which too eventually did. She got the second-tier education, the second-tier attention, the second-tier everything, and she responded exactly the way her father had responded to being the household's tolerated outsider. She got hard, not cruel, hard. There is a difference, and she has spent 60 years demonstrating it. She did not sulk about the arrangement. She simply declined to need the people operating it. By her teens she had the reputation she has carried ever since, the most difficult interview in the family, the one who does not take bait, the one who answers the question asked and not one syllable more, the one who once told a photographer to, and I will paraphrase for the sake of the broadcast, remove himself from her immediate vicinity. Everybody files that under rudeness. Watch it as a daughter's inheritance instead. Her father absorbed the household's condescension for 50 years, with perfect naval manners, because he had no choice, because everything he had came through his wife. His daughter had a choice. She was blood, and she used the choice he never had to say the things he was never allowed to say. Her rudeness is his silence, inherited and converted into speech. Now the household did not stop at the name, and this is the part where the marriage gets properly ugly, so stay with the dates. Philip had given up his Greek and Danish titles in 1947 to marry her. The British equivalent, Prince of the United Kingdom, did not come with the wedding. It did not come with Charles, it did not come with Anne, it did not come with the accession, and it did not come with the coronation in June 1953, where he knelt on live television in front of 27 million people and swore to be his wife's liege man of life and limb. Anne was too, watching it all from whatever nursery window that day had for her, and her father was on his knees in front of her mother, and the whole country thought it was moving. The princedom finally arrived in February 1957, 10 years after the wedding, and in that same month, the whole thing broke into the open for the only time in their lives. He had been away 4 months on a Commonwealth tour. The press ran the numbers on how long 4 months is, and the story went round the world in about 11 days. Rift at the palace, separate lives. Marriage in trouble. Buckingham Palace did something it almost never does. It answered. A flat, written on-the-record denial of any rift. Understand how far outside normal that is. That building's operating principle for a century has been that answering a story keeps it alive. They broke the rule for him once, in February 1957, and then never really again. Anne was 6, old enough to remember a house with newspapers in it that week. Old enough to be told, the way children in that family are told, nothing at all. Then, 3 years later, something moved, and it moved because of the children. On the 8th of February, 1960, Elizabeth issued an order in council declaring that her descendants who did not carry royal styles would use the surname Mountbatten-Windsor. His name joined to hers, at last, 8 years after the page that had excluded it. She was pregnant with Andrew at the time, and the two people who had forced the 1952 declaration, her grandmother and Churchill, were dead and out of office respectively. Now notice the detail almost everybody skims, because Anne lived it. The 1960 order did not cover the two children who already existed. Charles stayed Windsor, Anne stayed Windsor. The fight had been about her name. The order was her father's victory, and the order did not include her. She was 9 years old, and her father's name was now in the record attached to a category of hypothetical future grandchildren, while she went on signing the name of the house that had beaten him. I have gone round and round on how a child metabolizes that, and the answer, I think, is that she did not metabolize it. She stored it, and it came out of storage on the 14th of November 1973, in front of 500 million people. We will get there. It is the hinge of this whole story. Before the wedding, though, you need the one thing Anne built that was entirely hers, because it is the mirror image of the thing that was taken off her father. For Philip, the thing that was his was the Navy. Commanded his own ship at 29, mentioned in dispatches, standing in Tokyo Bay at the surrender, and all of it closed on the 6th of February, 1952, never to reopen. For Anne, the thing that was hers was the horse. Nobody gave it to her, which in that family is the entire point. The monarchy hands its people roles, titles, houses, duties. It does not hand anyone a European championship. She won that herself, at Burghley in 1971, on a horse called Doublet, at 21 years old, against professionals, in a sport where the crowd does not care whose grandchild you are because the fence does not care either. She was voted the BBC's Sports Personality of the Year that December, the first royal ever to win anything the public voted on purely for performance. Then she went to the Montreal Olympics in 1976, the only member of that family who has ever competed at an Olympic Games. Now watch her father in those years, because this is where the two of them become one story. Philip had played polo until his wrists gave out, and then in his 50s, he took up carriage driving, a brutal, technical, unfashionable sport, and he did not dabble in it. He helped write the international rulebook. He competed for Britain into his 80s, and the person he competed alongside, the person he argued course walks with, the person whose horses he knew by name, was his daughter. The two of them spent 40 years in the same muddy fields, the only two members of that family who had earned something the crown could neither give nor remove. That is the bond underneath everything that follows. It was never about affection, although the affection was real. It was about being the only two people at the address who knew what it felt like to be a person, separate from the institution, inside their own skin. So, November 1973, Anne married Mark Phillips at Westminster Abbey, a 25-year-old army officer, a commoner, an outsider, the son of a man who had made his money in sausages, and you could hear the palace drawing rooms clearing their throats about that from Hampshire. 2,000 guests, 500 million watching, and her father walked her up the aisle. Then came the moment I keep circling, the register, the legal record of the marriage, signed in the Abbey, and she signed it Anne Mountbatten-Windsor. The first time that surname had ever been used in public, anywhere, by anyone. Her father was standing about 6 feet away. His daughter, 23 years old on her wedding day, put his mother's family name, the name the state had ruled off his children in 1952, onto a legal document of the crown for the first time in the history of the country. Nobody made her do it. The palace could not have made her do it, and nobody in that building in 1973 was in a hurry to, because the wound was 21 years old and still tender enough that nobody touched it. She touched it, in ink, on camera, at her own wedding, with the whole world watching the dress. That is the closest thing to a victory her father ever got in the entire surname war, and it took 26 years, and it arrived as a gift from the one child who had understood from the nursery what the fight had been about. When people tell you Anne broke her silence about her parents' marriage, they usually mean the interviews after he died. They are wrong about the date. The first time she spoke about it in public was with a pen, in 1973. And here is where the story turns, because Anne then spent the next 2 decades watching the machine do to her husband a version of what it had done to her father, and there is no way she did not see it, because she had been raised inside the original. Mark Phillips walked into the same building Philip had walked into in 1947, an outsider with a uniform and a talent, and the building responded the way it always responds to men who marry in. It tolerated him at dinner and erased him everywhere else. The tabloids called him Fog, thick and wet, and the palace heard the nickname and let it run, the way it had let worse run about the bridegroom of 1947. He got no title. That part was offered, an earldom, the standard package for a man marrying the sovereign's daughter, and the couple declined it, which matters more than almost anything in this story, so slow down for it. In 1973, Anne looked at the arrangement her father had been given, a grand title with no name attached to it, a seat at the table with no say at it, a place in the family with no family in it, and she chose, deliberately on the record, the opposite shape. Her husband stayed plain Captain Phillips, and when her son was born in 1977, he was Peter Phillips, his father's name. Automatically, unremarkably, the way every other child in Britain takes his father's name, and 4 years later Zara Phillips the same. No declaration was required, no Privy Council convened. No grandmother objected, no Prime Minister intervened. The thing that had been refused to her father by an act of state, the thing he had called himself a bloody amoeba over, the thing that had sat underneath her parents' marriage for its first 20 years, Anne handed to her own children as a default, as nothing, as the most ordinary administrative fact in the world. Do you see what that is? It is the wound answered. Not with a statement, with 2 birth certificates. She could not give her father his name back. She made sure the machinery that took it never got near another family of hers. And no titles for the children either, her choice, both times, so that Peter and Zara grew up as people rather than as components. Every account of Anne as a mother circles back to that decision, and every account treats it as a quirk of character. It is not a quirk, it is a verdict. She had watched what the institution did to the last outsider who accepted its package, and she declined the package. Then, 4 months after the wedding, the gun on the mall. I opened with it, now here is the full weight of it, because it is the night that explains her. The 20th of March, 1974. A man called Ian Ball blocked her car, shot her protection officer, shot her chauffeur, shot a policeman, shot a journalist who tried to intervene, and told her to get out of the car. He wanted £2 million and a plane. And the 23-year-old daughter of the Queen of England said, not bloody likely. And then, by her own later account, delivered with all the drama of a weather forecast, they had a discussion. She kept him talking. She told him at one point that he was being silly. When her dress tore getting out of the far side of the car, she was, by her own account, angrier about the dress than the gun. The man who finally ended it was a passing former boxer who hit Ball once, and the police arrived, and it was over, and 4 men were in hospital, and Anne gave her statement and went home to her husband of 4 months. Now, her mother was the sovereign, so her mother's reaction exists in the record only as protocol. Her father's reaction exists in the record as almost nothing, because that generation of men did not file their fear anywhere. But watch what the family did. No statement about trauma. No retreat from public duty. She was back at engagements within days, and for 50 years afterwards she told the story, when forced, as a comedy about a torn dress. That is not a personality, that is a doctrine. It is her father's doctrine, the one he had been demonstrating since 1937, when at 16 he walked behind his sister's coffin through a German town between men in Nazi uniforms, and gave the cameras nothing. You absorb the blow, you file it privately. You give them the torn dress and not the fear. The palace had spent half a century failing to make Philip flinch. His daughter had been taking notes, and she built the rest of her life as his counterfactual, which is the piece of this story I find hardest to put down. Think about what Philip actually wanted, underneath the titles and the uniforms. He wanted work that was his, a house that was his, a name on his children, and a field where nobody was watching him. He got the first for 5 years in Malta and then never again. He got the second only in the last 4 years of his life, at Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate, 5 bedrooms, a kitchen you could heat with the door shut, a view of a field, from 2017 until his death. His daughter got all of it, 40 years earlier, at 26. Gatcombe Park, bought for her by her mother in 1976, a working farm in Gloucestershire, not a palace, not a grace and favor apartment in the machine's headquarters, a farm, with mud, where she has lived ever since, where she raised 2 children with no titles under their father's name, where she ran horse trials, and fell off fences, and answered to nobody's private secretary. People describe Anne's life as austere, as joyless duty. Look at it as the life her father was not permitted until he was 96. She was living his dream, on his behalf, for 4 decades before he got to live it himself. And when he finally got out, finally packed his books and his easel and his carriage-driving correspondence and left the building he had argued against entering in 1952, the person in that family who did not need the move explained to her was the daughter who had made the identical move in 1976. Now the Diana years, because no honest account of this marriage's ugliness gets to skip them, and because Anne's position in them is the least understood position in the whole family. In 1981, a 19-year-old outsider walked into the same machine, and the machine did what it does. It dressed her, briefed her, corrected her, scheduled her, and was unfailingly polite about all of it, and the politeness was the worst part. Philip understood exactly what was happening to her, because it had happened to him in 1947, and he was the one member of that household who wrote to her, long careful letters signed with the same word he used for his daughter, Pa. The letters were warm at the start and harder later, when he thought she was destroying his son, and I am not going to pretend the correspondence was a warm bath from start to finish. He wrote, though. Nobody else in that building did. Anne's position was different, and colder, and more honest, which is to say it was more like her father's than anybody admits. She had no patience for the circus, not because she lacked sympathy but because she had a fixed idea, inherited intact from Pa, about what the job was. The job was the work. The job was showing up at the regiments and the charities and the wet Tuesday openings whether or not anybody photographed it, and keeping your interior life out of the newspapers because the newspapers were not part of the contract. Diana made the interior life the story, and the machine broke on the collision, and Anne watched it the way you watch a car crash in a lane you drive every day. There is a comment somebody left under one of these videos a while back that I have not been able to shake. They wrote that the royal family does not break the people who marry in. It declines to make room for them, and then acts surprised at what happens next. Philip could have testified to that. Diana could have testified to that, and Anne is the one who watched it happen to both of them, 20 years apart, from inside the same building. Then came 1992, the year her mother called the Annus Horribilis, and inside that year there is an Anne chapter that gets 3 lines in the standard histories and deserves more. Her marriage to Mark Phillips ended, formally, in April 1992, after 3 years of separation, after the palace's machinery had done to him everything it had learned to do in 1947. And in December of that same year, she married Timothy Lawrence, a naval officer, her mother's equerry, a quiet, watchful, deeply undramatic man. Look at the shape of that wedding, because it is another verdict disguised as a detail. Not an abbey, not 2,000 guests, not 500 million people, 30 people, in a small church at Crathy, near Balmoral, in Scotland, chosen for the blunt practical reason that the Church of Scotland, unlike the Church of England her mother heads, would marry a divorced woman. The first wedding had been a state event she happened to star in. The second was hers. And notice who she chose to spend her life with, after watching everything she had watched. A naval man. A man with his own earned profession, his own sea, his own competence, the thing her father had been at 29 and was stopped from being at 30. She did not marry a courtier. She did not marry the machine. She married the counterfactual, the version of her father that got to keep his ship, and she did it in a church her mother's church would not give her, in front of 30 people, with no drama, and she is still married to him more than 3 decades later. The tabloids have never known what to do with that marriage, because there is nothing in it for them, which is precisely the point. It is the marriage her parents were having in Malta in 1950, recovered 40 years later by their daughter, in a colder climate, with the curtains drawn. 5 years after that, the worst week of the modern monarchy's life, and the grandfather again at the center of it. First week of September, 1997, Diana dead in a Paris tunnel, the family at Balmoral, the country turning ugly in its grief, and on the table the question of whether 2 boys, 15 and 12, should walk behind their mother's coffin through central London in front of 1 million people. Charles wanted them to. Others did not. The man who settled it was Philip, and the way he settled it has been reported the same way from several directions. He told William that if he did not walk, he thought he would regret it later. And then he said the part that ended the argument. "If I walk, will you walk with me?" He was 76. He owed that procession nothing. He put himself in it so that a 15-year-old would not be standing alone, the thing that had not been done for him at his own wedding in 1947, where his 3 living sisters were barred from the abbey and his mother sat alone in her pew. Anne was at Balmoral that week. She watched her father do it, and when the funeral came, she walked too, one of the very few women in that long male line behind the gun carriage, because she is her father's daughter, and walking is what that side of the family does. I want to be careful here, because the easy version of this story makes Anne cold and Diana warm and leaves it there. The record does not support the easy version. The record supports 2 women the machine had no room for, one of whom it destroyed, and one of whom had been issued, at birth, the armor of being Pa's girl, and survived. The difference between those 2 outcomes is not character, it is insulation. Anne had a father who had pre-absorbed the household's worst for 20 years before she was old enough to be its target, and Diana walked in unarmored. Anne knows that. I would put money on Anne knowing that better than anyone alive. Now the long middle, the part nobody makes documentaries about, because it is the part where the point of the whole story gets proven at industrial scale. From the early 70s onward, while the rest of the family generated headlines, Anne and her father generated statistics, and the statistics are the most eloquent documents in this entire account. His final tally, when he retired in 2017, was 22,219 solo engagements, over 5,000 speeches, 785 organizations. The Duke of Edinburgh's award, operating in over 130 countries, which has put millions of teenagers through expeditions they did not want to go on and were afterwards glad they did. And directly behind him in the annual tables, year after year, decade after decade, frequently ahead of every other member of the family including the heir to the throne, his daughter. 500 engagements a year, some years more. No glamour beats, no fashion coverage, no soft focus interviews. Regiments, charities, hospitals, Save the Children, which she has served since 1970, wet car parks, drafty halls, the exact same road her father walked from 1952 to 2017. The two of them were the family's engine room, and they were the two members of it the public was always slightly suspicious of, him for the gaffes, her for the face. And here is my one piece of outright opinion in this whole script, and I will plant a flag on it. The gaffes and the face are the same thing. They are the sound of two people who declined to perform gratitude for a role they had been assigned. Everybody else in that building learned to smile on command as a survival skill. Philip and Anne learned the other survival skill, the one where you do the work at double the required standard and keep your face exactly as it is, so that somewhere in the transaction you remain a person. The country spent 50 years reading that as rudeness. It was the most expensive integrity in public life, and they paid for it every day, in every headline, and they never once traded it in. Which brings us to the ending, and to Anne's silence, and to the breaking of it. In May 2017, the palace announced that the Duke of Edinburgh, 95 years old, was stepping back from public duties. His last solo engagement was a parade of Royal Marines in the rain in the forecourt of Buckingham Palace, and he stood in it without a coat. Then he went to Wood Farm, the farmhouse on the Sandringham estate, and the country spent 4 years arguing about why. The theory that won, the one you will still find repeated as established fact underneath footage of the man's funeral, is that he left out of spite. That he had served his 65 years, and the day the last obligation lifted, he walked out of his wife's house to make a point that could not be answered. The Queen came at weekends, they wrote and telephoned constantly. Every person who actually saw them in those years describes two people who were fine. But the spite theory ran and ran, because it is the version that fits the fairy tale with the sad chapter, the version where the marriage was always quietly fake. He died at Windsor on the 9th of April, 2021, aged 99, 69 years to the day after the page that took his name off his children, with his wife in the building. They buried him at St. George's Chapel on the 17th, 30 mourners in a chapel built for 800, because the rules said so, and the country got the photograph it will keep for 100 years. A woman of 94 in black, sitting entirely alone, 4 meters of empty stone on either side of her, at the funeral of her husband of 73 years. And at that funeral, watch the positioning. The coffin he had spent years helping plan arrived on a Land Rover he had helped design, because he had said he wanted to go to the vault in the back of something that could climb a hill in the rain. And walking behind it, in the small procession, his children, and standing afterwards closest to the widowed queen, the one who had the most practice at not needing to be handled, his daughter. 2 days after he died, Anne released a statement. Now this family does not release personal statements the way other families do. Their grief is normally routed through press offices and smoothed until nothing catches. Anne's was 1 page, in her own voice, and I am going to give it to you the way she gave it to the country, because every word of it was chosen by the most disciplined speaker in that family, and nothing in it is accidental. You know it is going to happen, she wrote, but you are never really ready. My father has been my teacher, my supporter and my critic, but mostly it is his example of a life well lived, and service freely given, that I most wanted to emulate. His ability to treat every person as an individual in their own right, with their own skills, comes through all the organizations with which he was involved. Read the architecture of that. Not my mother's husband, not the consort, not the Duke of Edinburgh, first among his 22,000 engagements, my teacher, my supporter, my critic. The only person in that family whose eulogy for the man described him as a person in relation to another person, rather than as a component of the crown. She buried Pa, in public, in 1 page, and the palace let her, because by then even the palace had noticed she was the only one the country would believe. And still, that is not the breaking of the silence. This is. That autumn, the family sat for a documentary about him, children and grandchildren on camera, and the whole exercise had the feel of an institution authorizing its own tribute, until it reached Anne. She talked about the barbecue at Balmoral he never let anybody else run. She talked about the carriage driving, the charts he read, the sea he never stopped being a sailor about. And she said, about the ending of him, the sentence I have been holding back for the length of this entire video, because it is the one that reorganizes the rest. She said that without him, life would be completely different. Now, every newspaper in the country printed that as a straightforward sentence about grief. And it is one. Almost nobody asked the next question, which is the question that the last 40 minutes have been building. Completely different from what? From what it had been when? Because the only period in which that family's life was not arranged around the fact of Philip was a period Anne never knew. She was 18 months old when the machine took her mother's husband and replaced him with the consort. She has no before. And yet the woman who measures every public word like it is being weighed against her, stood in front of the country, and described the whole of life as divided into 2 eras, the one with him in it, and the completely different one after. She did not say the family lost the Duke of Edinburgh. She said life changed. and in a documentary engineered to present the institution's version of the man, the most guarded member of that institution gave the whole game away in the most personal sentence anybody said on camera. She broke the habit of 50 years. Once. For him. And then she closed the door again, and she has not opened it since. You do not say a sentence like that about a marriage you believe was fake. You do not spend 1973 smuggling your father's band name into the public record on your wedding day, or 1977 handing his stolen right to your own newborn son, or 40 years walking his road at his tempo, for a man you think walked out on your mother out of spite. The spite theory never survived contact with Anne, and the people who run that family knew it, which is why, when the theory got loudest, it was her they all quietly pointed the cameras at. She answered it the way she answers everything. Once, flatly, without decoration, and with the full weight of being the only living person who was in the room for all of it. That is the testimony. That is Princess Anne breaking her silence. Not a scandal. Not a revelation about mistresses, because there is no mistress in this story and there never was. A verdict, from the only credible witness, that the marriage everybody spent 4 years calling cold was the warmest structure in that building, and that the ugliness was never between the husband and the wife at all. It was between the husband and the institution. It was a declaration signed in the 8th week of a reign by a 25-year-old who had no way through it. It was a household that made a man audition for 50 years for a place he had already paid for with his country, his church, his name, and his ship. It was a wife who could not give him back his name until her grandmother was dead and her prime minister was gone, and who then gave it back in the only form the machine would allow, a compound, for descendants who would never reign. And it was a daughter who saw every inch of it, and spent her entire life quietly legislating against it in the only jurisdiction she controlled, her own. That is the marriage, and that is why it was uglier than you think, and also better than you think, and both of those things live in the same house. He gave up a throne, a church, a country, and a surname to marry her, and the family he gave them up for spent 69 years making sure the world knew whose name was on the building. And their daughter, the one who was never asked, the one whose own name was the original battlefield, is the one who stood up when he died and told the country, in plain words once, what he had actually been. Not a consort, not a gaff with a title. A teacher, a supporter, a critic, and a life well lived, by the person best positioned on earth to check. Tell me below whether you think she has forgiven the machine for what it did to him, or whether the whole of her life since, the farm, the nameless grandchildren, the flat voice, the 500 engagements a year, is the sentence she has been handing down ever since. I have gone back and forth on it for weeks and I am still not settled. And subscribe if you want the rest of these, because there is a woman in this story I have mentioned twice and never once explained. The one in the gray habit at the 1947 wedding, sitting alone in the family pew. Philip's mother, Princess Alice, deaf, exiled, sanctified. The mother-in-law the palace pretended did not exist, and her story is stranger than anything I have told you today. That is the next one. He was called a bloody amoeba for wanting his own children to carry his name. 70 years later, the only name his favorite child ever used for him was one the crown had no power to grant or take away, and she said it out loud, on paper, in front of everyone, the day after he died.